I'm here today with Patty Krawec, author of a new book titled Becoming Kin, an Indigenous call to unforgetting the past and reimagining our future, from Broadleaf Books. Patty's an Anishinaabe and Ukrainian writer from Lac Seul First Nation. She's the co-host of the Medicine for the Resistance podcast and co-founder of the Nikanagana Foundation, which collects funds and disperses them to Indigenous people and organizations. Her work has been published in Sojourners and Canadian Living. She's active with the Fort Erie Native Friendship Center and the Strongwater Singers. Patty's a member of the Chippewa Presbyterian Church and lives in Niagara Falls, Ontario. You can learn more at broadleafbooks.com. So Patty, it's wonderful to have you join us, and congratulations on your new book.
Thank you. It's so nice to be here.
So to get started, can you tell us what else you would like people to know about you?
Oh my gosh. Well, the Nikanagana Foundation is something that actually I started a number of years ago. We had gone up north to, our one son was living in Iqaluit at the time up on Baffin Island, and we'd gone to go visit him, and we brought some supplies up, and I just started fundraising to send sanitary supplies up there. And then that just kind of morphed into a larger crowdfunding thing, and now it's a nonprofit. And last month, we redistributed just about $8,000. And so we have projects, and we do a lot of really neat things and fund a lot of really neat things. So I'm really proud of that foundation it's with Nora Loretto and Terrell Tailfeathers, and the three of us together founded it in the fall of last year of 2021.
Wow. Okay. Well, what else would you like to share about your background? I just kind of gave a very brief introduction there.
Yeah, I have a background in social work. I spent 16 years working in child welfare. I talk about that a little bit in the book, because of course child welfare is a very colonial thing that's doing a lot of harm among communities of color and disrupting families. And so I do talk about that, about my 16 years of working in that, and kind of how I started off as a true believer and kind of evolved, and my thinking changed over time, and then and how that impacted me and impacted the communities that I'm part of. So that's my background in social work. I have let's see, what else is there? I've got 3 kids, all of whom are adults. I have a grandchild that is very cute and obviously the smartest child around.
I know the feeling.
But my kids are all, activists and, ruckus bringers in all different ways. And so the things that I try to do, in terms of local and larger activism is really just an attempt to keep up with them. Because, they've really kind of taken the things that they've learned from me and done so much better with it. Wow. And I am just really proud of the people that they are.
That's wonderful. That's very cool. So let's get to the new book. As I mentioned, the title is Becoming Kin, an Indigenous call to unforgetting the past and reimagining our future. And if I'm not mistaken, this is your first published book?
It is. Yes.
Congratulations on that. That's a huge milestone.
It is, yes.
And how did the book come about?
Wow. Okay. So a number of years ago, so I'm sitting in church one Sunday, and the pastor starts talking about identity politics and how identity politics is out of control. And I mean, really, if a white pastor is going to start talking about identity politics, he should just not, because it's a complicated subject to get right. And more often than not, you're just going to cause harm. And it did cause a lot of harm. It was a really upsetting sermon to listen to for a number of reasons. So I got very angry about the things that were being said, largely about trans people. And, so I went home and I yelled about it on social media, and oddly, that didn't help at all. So I wrote an article about identity, identity as an Indigenous woman, about a church that found home in the Americas and yet made Indigenous people homeless in the process of finding home. And Sojourners magazine published it. And that's what it's about. It's about it's about the church finding home at the expense of Indigenous people. And, kind of where our identity sits in that, our identity being very much connected to the land and place. And what does that mean when we're pushed out of kind of the core of how we understand ourselves to exist as people. And then an editor from Broadleaf Books found it. So it's really kind of your discovered in the malt shop story. Valerie messaged me on Twitter, and I actually sent it to a couple of friends of mine to say, like, is this real? Like, am I being scammed out of money? Like, I don't understand what's happening. Because she had messaged me to ask if I had ever thought of writing a book. And I right up until that point, I hadn't. And I said, well, I am now, actually. And so my friend said, no, this is legit. This is legit. You need to jump on this. And so I did. So I jumped on it, and she was really, I can't speak highly enough of her, the relationship that we built, as a writer and an editor. There were times when I would soft pedal things that I was saying. Like I had described residential schools and epidemics and the trails of tears and all of these things. And then I moved on to talk about, then I moved on to talk about residential schools. And so I had said, like after this period of disruption and upheaval, and she highlighted that part of, and sent it back and said, that really doesn't feel adequate to what you've just described. And so I said, okay. So after this period of genocide and ethnic cleansing, and I was like, okay, thank you. And so that was really important because, as Indigenous people, as marginalized people, we're often careful in our language, right? Like careful in how we say things because, if you're too harsh, there's consequences for that, right? And of course, I had just come out from 16 years of working in a field where I had to be increasingly careful what I said and how I said, or I wound up back in HR. So for her to give me that permission to say it as plainly as it needs to be said, because of course, if we don't say things that plainly, then people can continue to pretend that it wasn't really that bad.
Right.
They can continue thinking about this period of genocide and ethnic cleansing as a time of disruption and upheaval, which really, I mean, she was 100% right. That was completely, completely inaccurate to what I had just described. So yeah, so that's what happened. I started off being angry and yelling about things on social media. It became an article that Sojourners published that then became something an editor noticed, and then she worked with me to turn it into this book.
Wow, that's very cool. I mean, so many authors, have much different journey, right?
Mm-hmm.
Put together a book proposal and try to get an agent, and be told no, 2,700 times before someone says
yeah.
Wrong.
And so I'm always very mindful of that, and then to be able to offer kind of support wherever I can, because I know that my experience was very atypical, and and so I want to be able to kind of bring as many people along with me as I can.
Well, Valerie's really excellent. I mean, both at finding new voices as well as what I've seen her working with folks to create the books that have come out, and she and the authors she's worked with have come out with just some excellent books over the last couple of years.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm not surprised of your positive comments about her collaboration with you.
Mm-hmm.
So who would you say the book is most intended for?
Yeah, she asked me that at the very beginning. Who was I writing to? And I have three audiences, kind of as I work that through. I mean, first and foremost, there's, the good Christians who make the evils of colonialism possible. Mm-hmm. I'm thinking about my own church community, about the churches that I grew up in, the churches that I've attended over the years, who are filled with mostly kind, generous people, and yet so incredibly, at times willfully unable to see what they're participating in and creating, and co-creating. So that's my first, that's my first audience. And then my second audience, so that would be kind of my experience growing up. My second audience is, my mom's family, and the newcomers and refugees. And how are they going to fit themselves into Canada, into the US, that, kind of builds themselves as these, great multicultural places, and yet really remain very much white supremacist settler colonial societies. So how do newcomers, fit into our place? And within that category, I'm also thinking of Black people, and where do they fit in? Like often when, my podcast, with my friend Carrie, that's something we've talked about, is when we talk about land back, what does that mean? What does that mean for her? She doesn't know where back would even be. Her story ends ends in Haiti. And she knows that Africa is back there, but she doesn't know where her ancestors came from. And so how do we form relationships in that context? And then the last audience, of course, is my paternal family, my Indigenous community. Not so much because I think I have anything to teach them. I mean, this is our experience, and they know their experience better, than I do in some ways, particularly if they grow up in their communities, but also to give them language. Sometimes I have found Indigenous media really helpful for me. It just helped giving me the language to talk about the things that I knew, to bring it out from where my lived experience was and be able to put it into words and frames that would make sense to other people to help them. So it's not that I think I'm teaching them things they don't know as much as giving them language to explain what they already know. So it's those three kind of different groups of people that I'm writing for.
Very cool. Well, you really thought that through well, which I'm sure Valerie is, glad to hear too, and the marketing people at the publishing house too. So, obviously we all know storytelling is central to Indigenous tradition and history, and you weave quite a few Indigenous stories throughout the book to introduce each section's frame. What do you think we can learn from those stories today?
One of the things, when we think about Indigenous stories is, it's an oral tradition, right? And they're changeable. So the story, and we've talked about this on the podcast with some of our guests, is the stories that might be told in Lac Seul are similar, but not the same as stories that are maybe told in, say, other Ojibwe or, Anishinaabe communities. So they're similar, but they shift a little bit, and they shift over time, as opposed to just kind of being these fixed stories that maybe Christians are more used to of, it got told a certain way 2,000 years ago, and we think that we still read it the same way today. Whereas oral traditions can be more changeable to what does the community need right now? What do we emphasize? How is this story shifting and changing to meet the needs of the community? A friend of mine just, this isn't one of the stories that's in the book, but I was asking her about Deer Woman, because the idea of a Deer Woman is, kind of re-entering the collective imagination, right? I mean, she showed up in the TV show Reservation Dogs, and even in Thor Ragnarok, right? Hela had that, beautiful crown of antlers that she wore. And what my friend had told me was that these ideas of vengeance and retribution weren't part of her original story, but they're part of her current story, partly because that's what our communities need right now. We need the idea of fighting back and protecting the things that need to be protected. And so the story evolves. And that's, I think, where Indigenous stories can be really powerful, because we're okay with that. We're okay with that fact that the story that my cousin tells me, from Lac Seul First Nation isn't exactly the same as the one that my friend from Curve Lake would tell it. I'm okay with those things being different. I don't need to force them together. And I think that's something, I grew up in the evangelical church. So the idea that there were possible discrepancies between the way Matthew told the story and the way Mark told the story, and we would turn ourselves into pretzels to force them to fit together, rather than just acknowledge that these were two different perspectives highlighting two different things, and that's okay. Kind of being okay with that kind of tension. Maybe tension is the wrong word, but just kind of being okay with that multiplicity, that these things can both exist at the same time. A friend of mine, Lauren, a friend of mine would call that like a quantum physics way of thinking.
Really, really.
Lawrence Gross in one of his books actually has a whole chapter on that, how Indigenous thinking is very, very in line with quantum mechanics.
So you mentioned in the book, you talk about unknowing. And can you explain a little bit about what that means in this context?
Unforgetting?
Or unknowing?
Yeah, well, unforgetting, because it's unforgetting the past and reimagining our future.
Okay.
Yeah, so the idea of unforgetting is something that I came across reading an interview with Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz. And she had talked about, I don't know, the idea of unforgetting was just really interesting to me because it's a new word, right? So, it's a new word. So what does that mean? What's unforgetting? And so what she had talked about is in Greek, the opposite of truth is forgetting. So we would say that the opposite of truth is lie. But she says in Greek, the opposite of truth is forgetting, and that's a very subtle difference. And so when we're then telling the truth, what we're doing is we're unforgetting things that we used to know, things that have maybe become, part of the substructure of our lives. Like we don't think about, we look at disparities, we look at, say, prison populations, for example, of why there are, there are so many Black and Indigenous people per capita in prison compared to white people. And we seemed to have collectively forgotten why that is, how we went from plantation to prison, to our current. And so it's unforgetting. It's getting back to those old histories, looking at them again, and seeing what stories we can tell from those histories that explain the world that we live in a better way, because those disparities exist. It's how we explain them that is the problem, because if there are more Black and Indigenous people in prison because there's something wrong with Black and Indigenous people, well, I'm going to have some thoughts about that because I don't think that's true. But there's a reason why there's more of us in prison. And so and the answer to that is in this history, in this time that we have forgotten. And so we need to unforget. We need to pull those things forward and look at them again and think about what they mean in our current world.
So as I mentioned in the introduction, you're part Ukrainian.
Yeah.
And obviously we've had this serious conflict. I mean, how's that affected you?
Well, I mean, I'm not, like my mom is Ukrainian. My grandparent, my grandfather was Ukrainian. My grandmother is actually German, part of the group that Catherine the Great brought into the Ukraine to displace the Ukrainians, to displace them. And so they created these little communities that remained German, like for 200 years. And so that was my grandmother's family. And then she married a Ukrainian man. And so I know that I probably have extended relatives who are in the Ukraine. I am obviously sympathetic to any group that's experiencing Russian imperialism. I grew up on those stories. My grandfather being conscripted into the Red Army and then fleeing and then getting caught and getting shot and left for dead. And I mean, he has quite a story. That could be a movie. That could be a movie all on its own. Meeting my grandmother, coming to Canada. When he was shot and left for dead, they didn't leave him with any identification. So when he wanted to come to Canada as a refugee, he had no papers. And at this point, and now, it's after the Second World War, he's in American-controlled Germany. He's not going to be able to get his papers from Moscow. They think he's dead. So he came to Canada using the paperwork of my grandmother's first husband.
Wow.
So he lived his entire life under another man's name.
Wow.
And we knew this. This was like an open secret in our family. But he would never tell us what his real name was. It wasn't until shortly before he passed that he would let us know. He let us know what his true name was. But he's still buried underneath another person's name.
Wow.
Yeah, and he was actually a little upset because George was 6 months older than him, and so or 6 months younger, I forget. So, anyway, so he had to work 6 months longer before he could retire. I remember him. So there are all those connections and those relationships that I've inherited, right? Like there's my connection to what's happening in the Ukraine now. There's my connection to refugees and migrants and people who enter these countries through all sorts of means, right? Like he came to this country with false papers, and made a life here, made a good life here. So that's part of the relationship I inherit, and part of the things that I think about is, well, then what is my responsibility to other migrants and other people trying to get here who may not have the kind of paperwork that our government says that they should have?
Yeah. Wow. That's a crazy story, isn't it? I mean,
It's a wild, yeah,
I've never heard
it's
of
a
that
really, really neat story. I got to sell
situation
that. I need a Hollywood person to be listening to
Yes.
offer
Yes.
to offer to make that movie.
So you weave both indigenous aspects of stories and Christian aspects of stories together in the book. Can you talk about your framework for doing that integration, how you think about it?
I love stories, right? I love stories. And once I understood the Bible as a collection of stories, as a collection of people who were just trying to understand how they fit into the world and how they had relationship with, with the divine, with the creator, with however they wanted to think about that, it started to make a lot more sense. It started to be less intimidating. And I looked, like, one of the things, that I had been thinking about it as I look through the book is, are there things that I would say differently? Like in the book, I talk about original instructions, and and that we need to get we need to get back to our original instructions, that the Bible contains original instructions. And now I would talk more about alternative readings, because I'm not sure that the original intentions of the people who wrote the various books, I'm not sure that they're even really knowable. I mean, I just recently came across the concept of originalism as it relates to the US Constitution, the idea that US Americans should interpret the Constitution according to the way the writers intended it. And we think of the Bible and the stories within it in the same way, thinking that we can and should interpret it according to how somebody 2,000 and more years ago intended. And if Americans can't even do that with a document that's 200 years old in a country with a continuous history and a well-documented history, like how much more difficult is it to do that with documents written, and they're not even the copies of documents of people who wrote down what they thought was important at the time from 2,000 years ago, a culture significantly different and in a different political setting from our own. So once I liberated it from that idea and think of it as stories that still have the power to speak to us today, just like Indigenous stories do, to tell us kind of how we can relate to each other, how we can relate to the world around us, then it really is just a mix of stories that make sense to us. And so if my audience is, I would say probably 50 or 60%, the white Christian, who wants to be a good person, then those are the stories that are going to make sense to them. And so can we look at them differently? Can we understand them differently? Like there's one point where I talk about a sermon, there's talking about the Babylonian captivity, and he says, can you imagine walking all that way into exile and looking back at your homeland? And I sat there, with a black man in my church sitting right in front of me thinking, yeah, I can think of at least two people in this room who can imagine that, imagine that pretty clearly.
Yeah, really.
And so it's about putting those things together. And can we look at these stories a little bit differently? And if we look at them a little bit differently, can that help us become better relatives to each other, as opposed to, just one side thinking that it's got all the good news for the other? Can Christians start asking Indigenous people, do I have good news for you? Because yeah, I do.
Mm-hmm. So are there any particular writers that you felt were particularly inspiring for you as you wrote this book?
I do actually, at the end of the book, I have kind of a list of recommended reading books that were really important to me. I would say Daniel Heath Justice has been not just his books, but also just conversations with him, have been really helpful. I know we mentioned Caitlin. We were talking earlier about Caitlin Curtis, Chanda Prescott-Weinstein. I mean, she just put out a book, just last year, The Disordered Cosmos, about, she's an astrophysicist, and it's just a fascinating book. Lawrence Gross, his book Anishinaabe Ways of Knowing and Being was really great. Anything by Leanne Betta-Samasaki Simpson. She's a Mississauga Anishinaabe writer from the Peterborough area. I talk often about the works of Alexis Shotwell and Aurora Levins Morales. They think a lot about what it is to be in relationship from a non-Indigenous point of view, and have some really neat ways of thinking about history and relationship that I thought fit in really well with what I was talking about too.
Hmm. So what would you say are your hopes for this book?
I hope to have a lot of conversations about how we can live together in this world, because we're talking more and more about land back, about rematriating the land and shifting our relationship. We're in a climate crisis. People, will say, oh, the Native people need to, Indigenous knowledge will save us. And we're like, no, we're not just here to clean up your mistakes. But, but relationship with us and moving forward together, that could make some serious. Each chapter kind of ends with a task, a thing that the reader can do. And it starts from as simple as noticing us. Just where are the Black and Indigenous people in your life? Where are we in your community, on your bookshelf, in your workplace, in the theater? Where are we? And then it moves through to, towards, kind of more in increasingly tangible tasks. And so, I asked people about land back. And one of the exercises that I ask people to do is, if you can't actually return the land, and a lot of people can't, they don't actually own the land that they live on. What if you acted like you could? How would that shift your relationship with the local community if the Indigenous people were your landlords? Like if the church gave back all of its land, to Native people with lease agreements and saying, okay, so we can lease this land for 5 years, in 5-year chunks, and, it's yours now. We're going to lease it for 5 years because, we just finished paying off this building and we'd really like to keep using it. How does that then change that church's relationship with the Indigenous community if now they're motivated to avoid eviction? Right? Because now they're like, okay, so we can live here. We got pretty cheap rent, but we don't want to be evicted in 5 years. So how is that going to change the relationship? It changes it significantly.
Interesting.
I'll do that.
Never thought of
like
that
before.
Never thought of that before. Wow. Well, Patty, again, congratulations on this book. It's very important. I'm looking forward to reading it. As we're speaking here, the book's not out yet. It'll be next month. And again, the name of the book is Becoming Kin, an Indigenous Call to Unforgetting the Past and Reimagining Our Future. And you can check it out at broadleafbooks.com. So Patty, thanks for joining us and sharing with us. And again, congratulations on producing this book.
Oh, thank you very much for having me. I appreciate the conversation.